case is widely regarded as being one of the worst cases of injustice against a person in Britain. And I agree with that assessment, but probably not for the same reasons that most people think it is. In fact, one of the reasons that I've wanted to write this essay and produce it as a video has been to right what I regard as being a terrible wrong against 19-year-old Patricia Curran and her family over the past 70 years. I realize that I am almost certainly, in fact certainly, swimming upstream in this. But sometimes it's necessary to swim against the tide. The truth demands it.
The 12th of November 1952 was a drab day in Belfast, Northern Ireland. 19-year-old Patricia Curran had spent the day at Queen's University, where she was in her first year, studying social sciences. She played squash during the afternoon at the university drill hall, afterwards leaving by the 5 o'clock bus to return to her home in the village of Whiteabbey, 5 miles away. When she didn't arrive home in the evening, her family became worried. Her brother Desmond Curran returned to the house at 9 p.m., walked up the long drive to the house, and noticed nothing. He went to bed at about 11 p.m. and was awakened at 1:30 a.m. by his worried mother, who told him his sister had still not arrived home. Mrs. Curran and Desmond drove to a neighboring house, where they made inquiries, but to no avail. They then called the police to inform them that Patricia was missing. A missile had set in across Whiteabbey Glen. A persistent dampness pervaded Glen House and its grounds. A policeman from the local constabulary, Edward Rutherford, arrived and found the father and brother searching the grounds, using a torch and making their way in a zigzag fashion through the shrubbery. Suddenly Desmond called out. He had found a body. It was Patricia. She was lying on her back, her head turned left, right arm flexed, legs together. 2 family friends, Malcolm Davison and his wife, arrived at this time in their car. Desmond tried to raise Patricia up, and as he did so, she seemed to make a noise, as if to breathe. Hopeful that she might still be alive, the company lifted her into the Davisons' car and drove her to a local doctor. But it was quite hopeless. Dr. Kenneth Wilson, who examined her at 2:20 a.m., found her body was cold, her limbs stiff with rigor mortis, and estimated that she had been dead for between 4 and 8 hours. Patricia Doris Curran was born in Belfast on the 3rd of April 1933. The daughter of Lancelot Curran and his wife Doris. Lancelot had served as MP for Carrick, was a Privy Councillor for Northern Ireland, and was a High Court judge. Both her elder brothers, Michael and Desmond, were barristers too. Patricia was intelligent, very attractive, and sporty. She was popular and outgoing also. During the summer holidays, she had worked driving a van for an engineering construction firm in the area, and had commenced university in September. She had a casual boyfriend from the university, John Steele, whom she had been seeing for the previous few weeks. In fact, he had seen her off on that final bus ride from Belfast at 5 p.m. Her family were strict Presbyterians, imbued in the conservative traditions of Northern Irish Unionism and the Orange Order. They were well known in the community, and Mrs. Doris Curran was known for her fundraising efforts for charity and for hosting political and social functions at Glen House, where they had lived since January 1947. Desmond, the younger of the two brothers, was a follower of moral rearmament, a movement enjoying worldwide success after the war, and which characterized the world's social and economic problems in terms of good versus evil. Patricia had a certain vitality, at odds in some ways with this, but she was herself of strong religious outlook. Inspector Alfred Kennedy of the local CID took charge of the investigation, and a search of the area was undertaken. Some 10 yards, 9 meters, from where the body of Patricia was found, her books and a portfolio, a thin flat folder for holding drawings, were discovered on the ground. Although it had initially been thought Patricia had been killed by a shotgun because her wounds were multiple and widespread, a post-mortem revealed that she had received 37 stab wounds from a narrow-bladed implement. Major organs were damaged by blows delivered with considerable violence. A rib had been cracked, and body, thighs, and scalp were all affected. She had died of internal hemorrhage and blood loss, and any one of 8 of the wounds would have proved fatal. She had not been sexually assaulted, was Virgo intacta, according to pathologist Dr. Firth, but the girl's underwear had been interfered with, and she may have resisted her assailant. In attempting to reconstruct Patricia's movements, police learned that she had been seen by passengers on the bus to Whiteabbey sitting alone, and had last been seen at 5:20 or 5:25 p.m. as she alighted from the bus outside the post office on its arrival at the stop, which was about a quarter of a mile from where she was found dead, and half a mile from her house. This seemed to suggest, therefore, that she had been attacked on her way home by someone who had either awaited her in the long unlit drive to her house, or else had entered the drive with her. It was peculiar that Patricia had chosen to walk home alone that evening, as she never did so, owing to the dark, forbidding nature of the 600-yard, 550-meter avenue leading to the house. She always phoned to the house first, and someone would drive down to collect her. If there was no one home, she would ask someone in the village to drive her. On this occasion she seems to have done neither. The funeral of Patricia Curran took place on Saturday, the 15th of November. Her parents and 2 brothers walked behind the funeral cortege, and window blinds and curtains were discreetly drawn along her way through the streets as a mark of respect. A small private service was held by the minister, who knew Patricia and the family well. The Inspector General of Police, Sir Richard Pym, took a personal interest in the case, and he was impatient for results. On the 16th of November, he told press, "I am particularly anxious to find out if anyone saw her go into the gate of her home, about 150 yards from the bus stop. I am not absolutely convinced that the murder occurred where the body was found." He had good reason for saying this. A 40-foot-long drag mark with traces of blood in it, and 3 buttons, which had been torn from Patricia's coat, were found there. These appeared to show that Patricia had been attacked and then dragged to the place she was found. Her books and a portfolio were placed on the ground, not dropped, it seems, or thrown, since items within the portfolio had not been dislodged, which subsequent experiments showed they would have been. The following day, Sir Richard Pym took the decision to seek the assistance of Scotland Yard, and as a result, Detective Superintendent John Capstick and Sergeant Dennis Hawkins were ordered to Belfast immediately to assist with the investigation. RAF Edenmore was situated just a half-mile from the bus stop, where many servicemen were stationed, and inquiries were initiated to ascertain the movements and whereabouts of all personnel on the evening of the murder. At a conference between detectives and Dr. Wells, a Northern Ireland pathologist, it was elicited that the knife used in the attack on Patricia had been narrow and long, and was probably something like a stiletto. Police cast a wide net in their inquiries. A notice was issued for a man seen in Patricia's company, who was 6 feet tall, about 30 years old, with a scar on his face. A dishevelled man, who gave the appearance of being a rough sleeper, who was seen in the area, was also sought. But November passed, and mysterious men with or without scars did not materialize. 5,000 statements were taken, and 11,000 interviews conducted. A confession from a man in Manchester at the beginning of December caused a sudden flurry of excitement, and the yard men flew there hopeful of a breakthrough. But it was a false alarm. The police were publicly upbeat. The net was closing, they said, but by mid-December it had still caught nothing. And as the year ended, press interest began to flag. Editors ran out of inspiration. Headlines shrank to small paragraphs. Confident declarations concerning imminent arrests were followed by weaker ones, denying them. A Dutch sailor was sought, a German, an Ulsterman in Canada, but nothing came of these inquiries. In the new year, a reward of £1,000, that's about £36,000 in 2024 terms, was offered for information leading to the arrest of the killer. There were no takers. Then in early January, Superintendent Capstick, reviewing the statements of the servicemen from RAF Edenmore concerning their movements on the night of the murder, had his attention drawn to a 20-year-old leading aircraftman called Ian Hay Gordon. Ian was from Dollar, Clackmanshire, in Scotland, though he had been born in Burma, where his father worked as an engineer for an oil company. At the outbreak of war with Japan, he spent time in a refugee camp, and soon afterwards made a fraught journey by boat to Britain, under constant threat from U-boat attacks. In 1949, he commenced his national service in the RAF and was posted to Edenmore Camp, where he worked as a clerk. Ian was hard-working, eager to please. He was also given to bouts of sudden anger, and had once punched his fist through a glass window. Ian was amongst the many servicemen interviewed, and 4 days after the murder he had written out a statement saying he knew the Currans, particularly Desmond, and Patricia had struck him as a lively, intelligent girl. It seems that Ian Gordon had met Desmond Curran at the Whiteabbey Presbyterian Chapel in 1951. The two had shared a pew at a service, and afterwards Ian had gone to lunch with Desmond. He had dined at the Currans' home on several occasions. After this, Patricia had made dinner for him. She was friendly and engaged him in conversation by the fireplace. According to Desmond, Gordon had telephoned him on the 23rd of December and was anxious to meet him. Desmond agreed, and the two met at a Belfast cafe. Gordon apologized for not contacting him sooner, with his sympathies for Patricia's death, and Desmond asked him what he thought of the murder. Gordon said he didn't know Patricia well enough to offer an opinion. However, he did offer the information that he had been in his billet at 6 p.m. that evening, seemingly offering an alibi for the time of the murder. He then asked whether Patricia had mentioned him at all, and whether she kept a diary and had mentioned him in it. Desmond said she hadn't mentioned him, and her diaries were not personal in nature. Gordon suggested that Patricia had been killed because she had found out something, and the killer wanted to keep her quiet. Further, he said that he could not understand why the killer had continued to rain a further 20 blows on Patricia, even though she had been killed with the 4th blow. Desmond asked how he knew the 4th blow had killed his sister, and Gordon said, "Wasn't it in the paper?" It wasn't. Ian Hay Gordon was an obvious suspect for Superintendent Capstick. He was odd, awkward, a loner, and didn't fit in with the other men in the barracks. Asked to account for his movements on the 12th of November, Gordon said he took mail to Whiteabbey Post Office between 4:15 and 4:30 p.m., returned to camp at about 5 p.m. and had tea until 5:15 with a Corporal Connor. He had changed into a sports coat and flannels at 5:30 and remained in the billet until 6, he said. Then he had gone to practice his typing in the camp registry before going to bed at 9:30 p.m. Inquiries revealed Ian had tried to persuade some of those in his billet to provide him with an alibi. They debated it, apparently, but concluded that the matter was too serious to lie to police about. Corporal Connor said Gordon had asked him to say he had tea with him on the 12th of November, but declared that he hadn't. Alarm bells were ringing for Capstick. Ian Hay Gordon seemed to fit the bill for the killer of Patricia Curran, but there was no evidence that he had killed her, or even that he had met her that evening. Nothing but the plain fact that he knew her and did not have an alibi. But evidence was soon gathering like a dark cloud. Ian had been seen by a woman coming down the drive from Edenmore Camp at 5:10 p.m., a time which would have placed him in the vicinity of the bus stop when Patricia alighted. He had also been seen by another woman coming out of Glen House Avenue just after 6 p.m., which would have been soon after the murder had occurred. Capstick was convinced he had his man, and he interviewed Ian Gordon on the 14th of January, telling him, "I am not satisfied about your whereabouts on the evening of the murder of Miss Curran." He then told him he expected him to tell the truth, and Gordon insisted he had told him the truth. He was released and asked to return to the police station the following morning. Capstick interviewed him again on this occasion and suggested his account was untruthful. He read him his earlier statement and asked him if he could tell him the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Gordon said, "May I think about it?" Capstick agreed, and he and Gordon left the room for this purpose, returning at last to say, "My lord and my mother know that I can speak the truth, and I am now going to do so. I am very sorry I have told you lies about the murder." Capstick called for Inspector Kennedy, who arrived and cautioned him. He was then asked if he wished to write his confession or the police to do so for him, and he opted for the latter. Ian Hay Gordon then made a detailed statement. "I left the camp at Edenmore shortly after 4 p.m. on Wednesday, the 12th of November, to deliver the mail to Whiteabbey post office," he said. "I was in there for 5 to 10 minutes, then went to Quarry's paper shop in the main street to collect the camp newspaper. I called in at the bookies off the main road. I placed a bet there on a horse for one of the airmen at the base. I forget his name. I then went back to camp with the newspapers. I probably had my tea at about 5 p.m. It took me about 5 minutes for my tea. I think I then changed into my civilian wear of sports coat and flannels. I then walked back alone to Whiteabbey and met Patricia Curran between the Glen and the Whiteabbey post office. She said to me, 'Hello, Ian,' or something like that. I said, 'Hello, Patricia.' She asked me to escort her to her home up the Glen. I agreed because it was dark and there was none of the family at the gate to the Glen. I can understand anyone being afraid to go up the Glen in the dark because the light is completely cut out because the trees meet at the top. I noticed Patricia was carrying a handbag and something else. I forget what it was, books or something. She was wearing a yellow hat. We both walked up the Glen together, and I think I was on her left side. After we had walked a few yards, I either held her left hand or arm as we walked along. She did not object. We carried on walking up the Glen until we came to the spot where the street lamp's light does not reach. It was quite dark there, and I said to Patricia, 'Do you mind if I kiss you?' or words to that effect. We stopped walking and stood on the grass verge on the left-hand side of the drive. She laid her things on the grass, and I think she laid her hat there as well. Before she did this, she was not keen on me giving her a kiss, but she consented in the end. I kissed her once or twice to begin with, and she did not object. She then asked me to continue escorting her up the drive. I did not do so, as I found I could not stop kissing her. As I was kissing her, I let my hand slip down her body, between her coat and her clothes. Her coat was open, and my hand may have touched her breast. I'm not sure. She struggled and said, "Don't, you beast." She struggled with me and said, "Let me go, or I will tell my father." I then lost control of myself, and Patricia fell down on the grass. She appeared to have fainted because she went limp. I am a bit hazy about what happened next, but I probably pulled her through the grass to hide her. I dragged her with her arms or legs, but I can't remember. Even before this happened, I do not think I was capable of doing what I was doing. I was confused at the time, and believe I stabbed her once or twice with my knife. I had been carrying this in my trouser pocket. I may have pushed her scarves against her mouth to stop her shouting. It is all very hazy to me, but I think I was disturbed either by seeing a light or hearing footsteps in the drive. As far as I know, I crossed the road and threw the knife into the sea. I felt that something awful must have happened, and quickly walked back to the camp. I went back to my billet and arrived there at about 6:30 p.m. There was no one in the billet at that time, and I saw I had some small patches of Patricia's blood on my flannels. I took a wooden nail brush from my kit. I got some soap and water from the ablutions and scrubbed the blood off my flannels. I then went to the central registry and did some typing. He said he had gone to bed at 9:30, had risen at the usual time, and went about his duties, hearing that morning about the murder. The RAF police arrived later to make inquiries, and subsequently he was asked about his movements. He had not mentioned to them he had been with Patricia Curran that evening. He had asked a number of people at the camp to provide him with an alibi, but they refused. When the statement was finished, it was read back to him, and he was invited to sign it. He said he would like to think about it before doing so, and was returned downstairs for this purpose. Quarter of an hour later, he returned and said he would sign the statement after adding the words, "I am very sorry for having killed Patricia Curran." He then signed the statement and initialed the alterations. After this, he was arrested and charged with the murder of Patricia Curran. The trial of Ian Hay Gordon took place on the 2nd of March 1953 before Lord Chief Justice McDermott. J. Edmund Warnock, Attorney General, led for the Crown, and H. A. McVeigh for the defence. George Chambers, an 11-year-old boy, told the court he had delivered a newspaper to Glen House at 5:45 p.m. on the 12th of November. He heard a noise in the bushes as he came down the drive, was frightened, and ran away. He knew it had been at about 5:45 p.m. because he heard the factory horn sound in the distance. The wife of a wing commander from Edenmore, Mrs. Mary Jackson, said she had seen Gordon coming down the Edenmore Drive at 5:10 p.m. on the evening of the 12th of November, just a half-mile from the Curran Drive. And Mrs. Hetty Little had seen a man leaving the Glenhouse Avenue at around 6:05 or 6:10 on the evening of the 12th of November. She later identified Ian Gordon in a lineup. A policeman who had escorted him at the magistrate's court said that when the knife found on the foreshore had been produced, Ian had said, "That is not it," and then, "They have not found it." Ian's sports jacket and flannels were examined, and tests showed they had been cleaned. Blood tests for residue, though, proved positive, and blood was discovered in both pockets. But the central plank of the evidence was clearly the confession made by Ian Gordon to detectives. The defense argued that all the tests of fairness had been infringed in the case. There had been pressure. There had been references to homosexual acts, coupled with discussions of his family life, which led to a supposition they would be conveyed to his parents. He was interviewed even though he was not yet 21 years old, and therefore, in 1952, a minor, An RAF officer or parent should have been with him during questioning. The confession should not, therefore, be admitted, as it could not be considered voluntary under the circumstances. The defence also called witnesses to testify to Ian Gordon's social incompetence. He would burst into tears if reprimanded, it was said. Doctors spoke of his hypoglycemia, which could lead to blackouts. It could also, said one defence doctor, lead to sudden outbreaks of temper. Another doctor gave the opinion that Gordon had a split personality, and that he believed Patricia must have spoken to Gordon first on the evening of the 12th of November. It was a two-handed game for defence counsel Agnew in his final statement to the jury, an awkward one. He asked them to disbelieve the confession, but also defended Ian on the basis that if it was true, then the accused had acted as an automaton and had no control over his actions. Lord Chief Justice McDermott summed up. He dealt with the question of the admissibility of the confession by leaving it to the jury to decide its value. He said they should weigh all the evidence and might take into consideration Gordon's failure to enter the witness box to give his own account of how he had made his confession. His memory seemed very good, he said. The jury needed to decide whether the blackouts played any part in the matter. He also said the jury needed to decide whether Gordon was insane. A person might be insane and yet still be responsible for their actions and capable of murder. Restating the principles of the Macnaghten rules, he said that the defence must prove that the prisoner did not understand that what he did was wrong, but he suggested that there seemed to him to be some evidence that his mind was affected at the time of the murder. The jury was absent for 2 hours in consideration of its verdict, and returned at 11 p.m. on the evening of the 7th of March to give it. Ian Gordon was guilty of murder, but insane. He was ordered by the Lord Chief Justice to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure at a secure mental institution. The verdict was generally well received. There was some sympathy for Ian Gordon and his parents. Amongst the legal fraternity, there was undoubtedly a sense of relief that the verdict had not been one of guilty of murder without the qualification of insane, because it would lead to a mandatory death sentence. There were, as the defence had argued, so many grounds on which the principle of fairness had been infringed by the police. To begin with, he was under 21 and should have been permitted to have a parent or a commanding officer present during his interviews. It was claimed by detectives that such an offer had been extended to him, but he had declined it. That was unsatisfactory. As a legal minor, he was not in a position to determine this. He was, during the procession of interviews which culminated in his confession, passed between one police officer and another in a manner which invited the suspicion that he was being coerced into making a clean breast of things. There is an obvious temptation for a detective to create such conditions, but it is not necessarily in the interests of justice to give way to them. Gordon was plainly troubled, uncertain as to whether he should make a confession, and at critical moments he was exposed to the advice of officers whom he was persuaded were acting in his interests. This could not have happened in the presence of a parent or commanding officer, which would have obliged police officers to act with restraint. Then there is the structure of the confession itself. The defence could justly point to its being constructed based on answers made to questions asked of the defendant. It isn't uncommon to detect this in statements which need to be constructed in a comprehensible fashion for courts, but in the case of a confession on which so much depends, it is unfortunate because it may suggest the narrative has been steered to a desired conclusion. Ian Hay Gordon was destined to spend the next 7.5 years in Holywell Hospital, Antrim, before being released. still only 28 years old, whereupon he returned to Glasgow, where he worked for a publisher and changed his name from Ian to John Gordon. He lived unobtrusively until the 1990s, when he retired and decided to seek to overturn the guilty verdict against him. A journalist, John Linklater, and others took up the case, and a head of steam gathered. In particular, there was the matter of the confession, which, it was believed, should never have been admitted. And without the confession, the case was weak. It was further believed that Gordon had been led to make the confession out of fear that a homosexual act he had engaged in would become known to his mother if he did not sign the confession. This had been raised somewhat obliquely in court in 1952, but by the 1990s had gained in traction because of the change in law and culture which had occurred since 1952. The matter finally came before the Criminal Cases Review Commission and was referred to the Northern Ireland Appeal Court in 2000. The confession was central to the case, and the Crown admitted that it could not be relied upon. A major plank of the original prosecution case had thus fallen away. The Lord Chief Justice, Sir Robert Carswell, said the judges concluded that the jury's verdict cannot stand. He also said, "There can be no question of ordering a retrial after this length of time, and we therefore allow the appeal and quash the finding of guilt." Ian Hay Gordon, now 68 years old, was delighted. He said, "At long last my name has been cleared. There has been a plethora of books and articles, documentaries, and even a drama written on the murder of Patricia Curran in the 70 years since her death. There is a happy uniformity of opinion concerning Ian Hay Gordon's innocence, and a general belief that the person responsible for her murder was Patricia's mother, Doris. It is argued that Patricia was killed at home, not in the drive leading to the house, that she was placed there by the family to deflect suspicion from the true culprit, and that the family conspired to cover up the murder. A row between mother and daughter, it is argued, led to the mother stabbing her errant daughter to death. The two had an ongoing fractious relationship, and Patricia flirted, had a liking for older men. The university books, neatly laid down and not noticeably wet in the rain that night, some yards from the body, is cited as evidence of them being placed there deliberately to imply that Patricia had been murdered on her way home. The removal of the body to Dr. Kenneth Wilson, when her limbs were stiff with rigor mortis, is peculiar. They could not possibly think she was still alive, surely. Mrs. Curran, it is claimed, spent time in a psychiatric hospital following her daughter's death. But against all this, it must be said that arguments between a mother and a teenage daughter are a commonplace. They do not result in a mother stabbing her daughter to death 37 times. Patricia was not promiscuous because she was a virgin when she died. The books were not wet because they were under the canopy of the trees at that point in the avenue where they met. And the newspaper accounts speak only of mizzle, not of rain, and Doris Curran did not spend time in a psychiatric hospital, nor did she suffer mental problems for which she required treatment. She was a capable woman, an organizer of fetes for the British Legion, a political hostess, and tireless charity worker. It is even claimed that the father was a compulsive gambler with huge debts. But there is nothing to suggest such a thing. He liked to bet on horses. It is a common enough passion in Ireland. A witness heard a cry at a time much later than the supposed time of her death, it is claimed. But the police investigated this claim and tested whether this woman could hear a scream in the Glen from the location where she claimed to be. She couldn't, and no one else heard the scream. There were discrepancies in the time given by the judge at which he said he had made a call to Patricia's boyfriend asking if he had seen Patricia. He said it was at 1:30 a.m. The boyfriend said 2:10. There are always discrepancies concerning times given by people in such cases. Time is nowhere observed to be more relative to its observer than when its absolute independent authority is essential. One or both were wrong, and yet it seems the boyfriend in this case was certainly wrong. Why? Because at 2:10 a.m., 3 policemen, the judge, Desmond, and Mr. and Mrs. Davison, were gathered around the body of Patricia, having just discovered her. It took them until 2:15 to raise her from the ground where she lay, and to get her, with difficulty, into the Davisons' car. Even supposing Judge Curran had returned to his house at this point directly, he would not be back at the house a quarter of a mile away for at least 5 minutes. He could not have reached the telephone to call Steele before 2:20 at the earliest. Steele is clearly mistaken. It accords with common sense that Judge Curran would have made the phone call to the boyfriend immediately prior to calling the police at 1:30 a.m. And there is, for me, a decisive factor in this matter. What possible advantage is it supposed that Judge Curran could derive from calling to inquire about his daughter at 2:10 a.m. when he was aware she was already dead? It gave him no advantage, provided no alibi, and would simply expose him to an unnecessary risk, an absurd risk. As is common enough in such cases in which writers wish to promote the innocence of a suspect, the victim must become the villain, and vice versa. It is a gross consequence of the enthusiasm of one view to eclipse that of its antithesis at any cost. There are 2 things must be said about this theory concerning the mother being the perpetrator of the crime. First, there is no evidence whatsoever to support it. Second, it is improbable in the extreme. Mothers do kill daughters, and vice versa, but to do so by stabbing Patricia 37 times, crunching through bones, penetrating so deeply that stab wounds in the front showed up as bruises on the back, is a violence born of a deep personal nature, not of a filial dispute. They might argue, they might even come to blows, but the end result would not be that of the mother stabbing her daughter 37 times. And when Patricia was not found, Mrs. Curran rang her friends. She drove out in her car with her son Desmond to visit neighbors. She was frantic with worry. In all respects, she acted as any mother in such a situation would act. It is said she was depressed following her daughter's death. That would hardly be surprising. It confers no suspicion on her at all. But someone killed Patricia. Who was it? It is surely the case that she was murdered by Ian Hay Gordon. The evidence for this is compelling in every possible way, and beyond the strict evidence required by a court of law, there is the historical judgment we may apply as normal, intelligent human beings to the matter. And in this, all roads lead to Ian Hay Gordon. It should be noted that Lord Chief Justice Carson, in setting aside the original verdict, did not declare Gordon innocent. It caused irritation amongst Gordon's supporters that he did not do so, but he quite properly pointed to the need for a retrial, because the verdict was based not simply on the confession, but on a great deal of other evidence, which the trial judge in 1952 had asked the jury to consider, as well as to what weight to apportion to the confession. The jury did as they were charged, and they found Ian Hay Gordon guilty. But Justice Carswell also pointed out that a retrial half a century after the original trial was now impossible. There was little choice but to allow the appeal and quash the verdict. Ian Hay Gordon could claim to be innocent by virtue of the fact that the verdict was, in the view of the appeals court, unsafe. But the evidence for Gordon's guilt is compelling. 1. He was seen coming down the drive of Edenmore by the wing commander's wife, who knew Gordon, at 5:10 p.m. This was exactly the time the killer would have been approaching the vicinity of the bus stop where Patricia Curran would alight in just 10 minutes' time. 2. He was seen by Mrs. Little coming down the Glen Avenue at 6:05 or 6:10 p.m. at around the time the killer would have done, having murdered Patricia. 3. He sought an alibi from many people for the period between 5 and 6 p.m. He knew the crucial period for which he needed an alibi before the post-mortem had ascertained the probable time of death and the details of Patricia's movements were known. Only the killer had such knowledge. 4. He rang Desmond Curran and was anxious to meet him, and when they met, he probed him on the killing. He was trying to find out what the police might know of the matter. The police were giving nothing away. He wanted to know of any suspicions they may have of him, of what Desmond had told them. 5. He said to Desmond on that occasion that he could not understand why the killer had struck her so many times when the 4th blow had killed her. Desmond asked him how he knew this. He said it was in the newspaper. It wasn't. The post-mortem established that any one of 8 blows would have killed Patricia, but Gordon knew that 4 was sufficient. 6. When Desmond mentioned a stiletto to Gordon, which was the police's favoured theory at this point, Gordon said he thought an ordinary knife would do. He was, as it later turned out, right. Only the killer could be in possession of this fact. 7. A policeman attending Gordon at the magistrate's court said that when the knife was produced, and Gordon suddenly saw it for the first time, he commented, "That isn't it." "Why?" inquired the policeman. "They haven't found it yet," he said. It was said the policeman was making this up, but it has the ring of authenticity, of genuine surprise about it. He had expected the knife found on the foreshore to be his, but to his astonishment an unfamiliar knife was produced. It confers no advantage to the policeman, and presents many contrary hazards for him to lie about this, because it was a denial of the police evidence itself. The conclusion must be that the police had found a knife, but that it was not the knife involved in the killing, and Gordon knew this. 8. Gordon said in his confession he had scrubbed his flannel trousers because they had blood on them. Such signs of cleaning were observed. He was not lying in his confession concerning this. There was blood in his pockets, too. It was suggested by the defense this had been from a cut finger, but blood in both pockets could not reasonably have come from a cut finger on one hand. 9. In the confession he said he was startled by something, a noise. At 5:45, the 11-year-old newspaper boy had heard someone in the shrubbery and ran away, alarmed. The two events concur as nearly as we would expect them to. Patricia would have been killed at around this time. 10. Patricia usually called home for a lift when she arrived at the bus stop, but as chance would have it, no one was home that afternoon at 5:20, nor did she call on someone else in the village to give her a lift, which was her usual backup practice. Why? Because she didn't need to. She saw a friendly face, a young man from church, a friend of her brother's whom she had made dinner for, and sat with at the fireside chatting. A shy young man who obviously liked her, and she asked him to escort her up the drive, just as Gordon said she had. He was telling the truth. 11. Ian Gordon was interviewed by a defense psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis, and in spite of the in-depth conversations they had, in an effort for Lewis to understand Gordon, he accepted in full the confession. He must have discussed the events of that night with Gordon. Again, it seems inevitable to conclude that Gordon repeated the gist of what was in the confession to Lewis. Lewis went so far as to say he believed that Patricia had spoken to Gordon first. That is consistent with everything we know of the situation. as well as directing us to the kind of things which Gordon had discussed with Lewis. 12. There are too many details given in the confession, details unknown to any other person, and not in the possession of the officers conducting the interviews, to suppose that they could have a source other than the killer himself. Ian Gordon. The detail of the scarf being used to attempt to stifle Patricia's cries was something only the killer could have known. Gordon knew of it and volunteered it himself. This was invention bordering on the impossible, because it involved the unknowable. He spoke of halting with Patricia at the darkest place on the avenue, where the trees met overhead, out of reach of the light from the road. Is it possible that such an observation could have been made and then contrived into an invented account by police? No, it is the observation of one who walked this way as the light was failing on the 12th of November, and had arrived at the suddenness of decision. It was the observation of Patricia Curran's killer. 13. Ian told Desmond Curran that he thought Patricia had been killed to prevent her revealing something about someone. It is a strange motive in the circumstances. The obvious one was simply a thwarted sexual attack which had cost her her life. But Ian Gordon was, it turned out, correct. Patricia had threatened to tell her father, as he persisted in trying to kiss her. He acted to prevent her from telling her father, and he acted in rage. 14. In all respects, the confession was detailed and accurate, except in the claim he made concerning Patricia's willingness to kiss him. That was a distorted view of the assault, and its incongruence amidst the other detail reinforces the integrity of the confession. Patricia did not agree to anything of the sort. A highly attractive young woman with a boyfriend, outward-going, confident, intelligent. What possible attraction could she feel towards the inept, awkward young man whom she came across late that afternoon? None. She felt a friendly benevolence to a recognizable face, whom she surely approached first, as Dr. Lewis suggested, and asked him to escort her up the avenue to the Glen. Ian Gordon himself said this was so. It is a matter of common sense that it occurred in this way. The confession was compromised without any doubt by the fact that he had no RAF officer present in lieu of a parent when he was of a minority age. But it is a technicality. 21 was the majority age in 1952. It was lowered 17 years later to 18. But whether the confession was made by a 21-year-old or by an 18-year-old, it does not mean that it is wrong. It means that the law disallows it in a court, because it falls below an age at which it is determined a defendant needs the protection of a parent. The substance of the confession suggests its veracity. It is essentially an account of what happened and can be relied upon to a point. We can plainly discern where the account has been rounded out. The judge placed the matter of its acceptability in terms of its details in the hands of the jury. Perhaps technically he should have ruled it out. But that said, the jury did consider the confession, along with the other evidence, and determined on its basis that it was a true account. That is important, not from the point of view of the law, but from that of knowing what happened. And the argument that Ian Gordon was coerced into signing the confession by threats made that his parents would learn of a homosexual act he had engaged in previously holds no water, because both his parents sat at the back of the courtroom while such arguments were discussed in 1952. The threat of exposure only had power over him while they didn't know. Once they did, it had none. He might then have gone into the witness box and rubbished the confession. But he didn't. He didn't because he couldn't. The judge at the original trial referred to this failure of his and so did the Crown in 2000 at his appeal. That is because the confession he made was true, and if he was exposed to cross-examination over this, it would be abundantly clear that this was so. There are many other facts and nuanced occurrences too numerous to mention, which push us inexorably in the direction of Ian Gordon being the person who murdered Patricia Curran. Exactly what happened is easy enough to understand. For the most part, it is as Ian Gordon laid down in his confession. He rounded out the corners with a little favourable spin. Her acquiescence to a kiss, the extent to which he attempted to sexually abuse her. He went only as far as saying he ran his hand down her body beneath her open coat. But he went beyond this. Ian Gordon had pressed his advantage beyond anything he was prepared to admit. It is likely that Ian had developed an obsession with Patricia, mistook, as men sometimes do, her smile bestowed upon him as her brother's friend for something else. His persistence in asking of Desmond if his sister had kept a diary or spoken of him is notable. Why should she have mentioned Ian to her family or in her diary unless there had been some prior interaction between them? Or unless Ian entertained some private, fantastic conviction that she was attracted to him. It is entirely possible that Ian had discovered Patricia regularly took the 5 p.m. bus home from Belfast, and that he was in the habit of going out around 5:10 in the hope of encountering her. It would hardly be unusual for a man to try to contrive an assignation with an attractive woman. And Ian had, after all, discovered a woman who was at once very attractive, and who did not treat him with disdainful mockery. She was nice to him. He may have walked her up the avenue before, but whether he had walked her home before, or this was the first time, at some point he made his move and took her arm. She did not resist it. He said in his confession he took her arm or her hand. If it was her hand, she would have disengaged, lessened its offence. They walked up the avenue, him holding her arm, a matter of great intimacy to him, a thrilling notion in Gordon's mind that he had some form of consent from Patricia. To her, this awkward young man offered no threat to her. She was wrong. She chatted on their way up the avenue. He was silent, a certain brooding tension within. Perhaps he took her books to carry them, an act of sweethearts to him. To her it was nothing. It would be obvious to her he liked her. But she had no idea that his quiet devotion could turn into something more dangerous. At last the moment he had been building to arrived. He stopped and asked her for a kiss, an inept proposal. He placed her books on the floor. Now her manner changed abruptly. "No," she said. It was a horrible moment. "Let's walk to the house now." But he had breached the silence hemming him in. He persisted with terrible fumbling misjudgment. He took hold of her and tried to kiss her. That raised alarm. "You beast," she said. Again, her words are true to Patricia, to a young woman in her situation. Anger, shock, disgust, a warning. Ian Gordon did not have to invent these words because he was telling the truth. She says she will tell her father. He is angry now, insulted by this. Her rejection is absolute. He cannot stand to be reprimanded, his mother later tells the court. He cannot stand the mildest rebuke of an officer. He is prone to sudden bursts of violence when thwarted. He has put his fist through a plate-glass window previously, had a black eye from an altercation in the billet just days before the murder. And now this is the ultimate rebuke. He breaks now with a fury, attempts to violate her with force, and when Patricia resists, shouting, he punches her. There was evidence she had suffered blows before death. Tries to stifle her cries with her scarf. He drew his knife from his pocket and stabbed her repeatedly, an act of expiation amidst his uncontrolled fury. He told Desmond he could not understand why the killer had stabbed her so many times when she was dead after the fourth blow. Indeed, he could not understand it. He knew that she was dead after the first 4 stabs penetrated, yet he continued to stab her repeatedly until his fury was spent. His comment to her brother was one of wonder at his own actions. He concealed the body to delay discovery, heard the boy deliver the newspaper, and waited, fearful. He then left the avenue, but was seen by Mrs. Little. He returned to the billet and cleaned himself up, scrubbed his clothes. He went to the registry to practice typing, to restore normality. Later, he did all he could to persuade others to give him an alibi. Was Gordon insane? It was the jury's verdict, a sympathetic one, and it saved him from the death penalty. But the verdict of insanity needed to be proved. Oddness would not do it. The law is exacting in its demands in this respect. The defendant must prove that they were insane at the time of the murder, and even if insanity is proved, they must prove that their insanity was such that it diminished their capacity to understand that what they did was wrong and would be punished by the law. Ian Gordon was odd. He was a misfit, and it is difficult not to feel some sympathy for him. The butt of jokes in the barracks, isolated from the brusque camaraderie of young servicemen. He was socially incompetent, was without friends, but Ian Gordon was not insane. He was a leading aircraftman, with responsibilities as a clerk in his unit. He was known to be diligent in the execution of his duties too, and most importantly of all, he understood the difference between right and wrong, and he certainly understood that the assault and murder of Patricia Curran was wrong. He made efforts to cover his tracks. When he had killed her, he tried to conceal her body by dragging her 40 feet into the shrubbery and undergrowth so that the discovery of his crime would be delayed. He made efforts to dispose of the knife immediately. He cleaned his clothes using a brush and soap and water. He understood the danger to him of lacking an alibi and took urgent steps to remedy this. He made false statements regarding his movements to police and persisted in these until the day of his arrest on the 15th of January. And he phoned and met Desmond Curran in an attempt to learn whether Patricia had mentioned him in her diary. Ian Hay Gordon showed deliberation. He took intelligent steps to avoid detection, and he surely got away with the murder of Patricia Curran. The family were destroyed, but people go on even when they are destroyed because they must. There was a permanent sadness lingered over them, like a missile over the Glen one November night in 1952. Desmond Curran did what, for one of his faith, background, and family, was unthinkable. He converted to Roman Catholicism and trained for the priesthood. He was ordained in Rome in 1964. It must have been a shock to his family and to their friends, but Sir Lancelot travelled to Rome to see his youngest son ordained into a faith he had resisted for all of his life. Age and tragedy alters us. Father Desmond Curran went to South Africa as a missionary, and he had penance to do. The guilt he felt at introducing his sister to her killer must have hung about his neck like an albatross. He never doubted that Ian Hay Gordon, with whom he had shared a pew at the Presbyterian Church in the summer of 1951, had murdered his sister. He met Ian in later years. How is it possible to forgive the killer of a loved one? We try. Father Desmond Curran was known for his simple, abstemious life amongst the poor of Africa, where he died in 2015. Ian Hay Gordon was destined to be one of life's misfits. He always had been. He enjoyed some celebrity following his successful appeal in 2000, gave many interviews, and seemed grateful to all who had helped him. He still hankered for the approval of others, was convinced that the quashing of the verdict against him gave him absolution. It hadn't. He died on the 14th of September 2012 at the age of 80, 60 years after the death of Patricia Curran.